Ramsay, it is good to be here with you. And
Likewise.
everyone, thanks for coming and checking out the pod. We're going to be talking today about AI and AGI and synthetic labor with my friend Ramsay Brown, who I interviewed back in, I think 2022 it was. But what's crazy about Ramsay is that in 2021 when I met him, this is before ChatGPT even came out, he was talking about synthetic labor and AI agents, which only now, just within the last 3 months, is starting to enter the VC parlance.
Yeah.
So you have a track record that I can at least testify to of being very early on a lot of these things.
Yes.
And so when you came on last time, you gave us a glimpse of what the next few years were going to be. And it turns out you were right. Everyone is now talking about agents and entirely massive sums of money, $500 billion, things like that. Those are numbers being thrown around by agencies, governments, corporations in terms of like using this money to build new AI models, train them, et cetera.
Probably still small, by the way.
Probably still small. So yeah, I'm excited to hear what you think the future holds, at least in the next few years. So thank you so much for coming.
Of course. Thanks for having me. This is going to be a ton of fun.
It's January 2025.
It is.
We're like 3 days into the new presidential administration.
We are.
But more importantly, rather than caring about things in terms of like human political, time frames, maybe correctly to think of this as the end of the Anthropocene. Who cares who's president if the Anthropocene is at its twilight,
Right.
And you believe that we are at the dawn of something new.
I do.
Would you like to tell us what that is and what it is called?
Yeah. So we've been playing with this idea of something we call the Synthocene, the period of synthetic impact on the biosphere and the ecology being the predominant driver. And it's worth kind of backing into why we think about it this way.
Yes.
So it is like to armchair natural historians, the term Anthropocene points to this idea that in the past, depending on how you want to define it, some people put it at the Trinity test site explosion, some people put it at earlier, but by some facet of defining time through human involvement, we now no longer live in an era of geologic time defined by natural forces reshaping the planet, but rather by human forces being the predominant driver of what reshapes the planet. And our proposal is that for what is happening right now in synthetic intelligence as a field writ large at the intersection of data and energy and rollout and impact, the right way to think about the next chapter of human history, which we appear to be on the start of, or slightly after the starting gun. And I go back to the Sam Altman tweet of near the singularity, unclear which side, or something to that effect. Because we could accidentally be on the other side of it already, and this is what hard, fast takeoffs look like, is they're kind of jaggedly edged. You don't know really where exactly they lie on the timeline, and in some places you're already past it, in others you still have a lot of work to do. But what's unambiguous to me is that in terms of like the total portion of events and impact that define how Earth goes from here out, humans will play a smaller and smaller piece of that pie. And in the past 200 years, we came to dominate the pie. We were the things that were changing Earth. And I think it is now going to be the systems we've built, particularly the digital systems, the infrastructure and data systems, and the increasingly high agency autonomous synthetic intelligence systems that we've built that come to be the predominant driver of change on the planet, both in terms of our lives and our infrastructure and our governance practices and our tooling, but also the reshaping of the ecology itself. This is not to make a claim this is going to be good or bad. It's not saying that the Synthocene is a time defined by any particular direction, as much as this marks the point on the calendar where we get to say, from here on out, we should expect us to not be the predominant driver of that change in the way that we have been over the past 100, 200 years.
Yeah. A little bit ominous for sure, but exciting nonetheless.
So a question, why does it feel ominous?
Well, Anthropocene feels kind of nice and warm and fuzzy because, as far as I can tell, I'm an anthropology, human, something like that.
Right.
I'm not a synth.
No, you're not a synth.
At least not yet.
You're not
whatever that means.
You are still a mostly organic substrate humanoid, like most of the rest of us. And there's a thing that's, I think, the natural intuition for apex predators who are used to being at the tippy thing to look at the landscape and see that there's something else here that might be niche competitive. Yeah. And the people who are saying things like we need to slam the brakes and stop it all are saying any time that this has ever happened in recorded history, it's always been we were the apex predator and some other species either was also an apex predator or wasn't, and then we changed their lives very dramatically, irreversibly, and outside of their control. Therefore, won't that happen to us? And that is a large claim, and there could be some truth to it, but we don't know. And I think from the precautionary principle, their perspective is, therefore, don't even try risking it. But that seems kind of disconnected to the underlying incentive structures and reality of the matter.
Right. So you can't not risk it.
Right. So we don't want
other people will risk it.
So I can respect the ominous, but I love poking people as to why it sounds ominous. And it's because we're used to being in charge of this thing. We've always been in charge of this thing.
Yeah. Do you know, is it Apocalyptica or Apocalypta, that Mel Gibson movie where the guys are like running through the Mayan or Aztec forest, like the whole movie, and they're trying to kill each other? And then at the very end, have you seen the movie?
I'm just go ahead and spoil it for me.
So basically the whole movie is like, I forget if it's Mayan or Aztec, but one guy's running away and being chased by these other Mayans or Aztecs. That's like 2 hours of that.
Yes.
Crazy.
Yes. Sounds about right.
The end of the movie, they end up on the beach and they see the conquistador ships coming in, and they realize there's something else that's coming to, interfere with their lives, and whatever they've been up to, their own little quarrels, no longer seem as relevant because now there are these things that they barely even recognize,
right,
kind of descending on their shores.
And
it does sort of feel like we're at that point, whereas maybe 3 to 5 years ago, AI and stuff was thrown around almost like, I'm sure maybe the Mayans or those people, they talked about their gods in a very like abstract sense. But then all of a sudden now the ships are actually coming. You can see them.
Yeah.
And there's nothing you can do.
No. And I appreciate like the lowercase g God approach to like talking about this, because if you either look at Twitter and hear how people who are very, very close to Frontier Labs or inside Frontier Labs talk about like, what are the pathways? What are the outcomes? They'll say things like, look, we're going to build God. We're going to try to enslave God. Building enslaved God is the only good path forward. All other paths actually kind of suck. And I can appreciate different facets of that, ranging from either don't try to build God or build God and it escapes. And you listen even this week to people like Dario Amodi talk about, look, I think a few years ago, we thought AGI was a lot farther away than it appears to be because of some compounding factors that we didn't see clearly from first principles, especially around the use of synthetic labor for generating training data for increasingly sophisticated, going beyond just straight inference to reasoning models, and the ability for them to create data that's useful for the next generation of models. We appear to be in the self-improvement cycle. And because this is now the case, all of our timelines have gotten shorter to get to a thing that more or less across the board resembles human-like intelligence. And then the immediate frontier after that, if we haven't already gotten close to it, we'll be getting close shortly, will look like getting to superhuman intelligence, for which you've got a thing that is going to be smarter than the median person or smarter than every person. And that carries with it weird ramifications. Dario's at the Davos conference right now. My friend Azim Azara is there and is doing live video streams of it every day about like, hey, summary of what's going on. And he's brought up that if what Dario is saying is true, or what Satya Nadella is saying is true, or what Sam Altman is saying is true, almost everybody is asleep at the wheel. Like almost every, so Davos is famous for like these world leaders, ostensibly, these are people who captains of industry need to be paying attention. And you've got these guys with this track record and these tools, these platforms that we now know as household names, saying, guys, we have like 2 years on the shot clock until we are not game over, not lights out, but we have to contend with something that is smarter than all of us, and we don't know what happens then. And everyone's going, cool. Yeah. So anyway, my 10-year plan for roads, and it's like, sorry, did you not fucking listen to me when I just said this? Well, and again, this is not panic, but it is kind of like this weird, like, is there a gas leak in here kind of moment?
I understand. Yeah. I mean, well, before we talk about what the next 2 or 3, maybe we won't go all the way out to 10 years looks like, maybe rewinding 2 or 3 years ago, 2021 when we first met, and you were talking about agents before anyone else was talking about agents. This was when I think there was GPT-2,
Yeah.
which OpenAI was saying was too dangerous to release.
I remember that. That was very fun.
They were like, we basically created this thing. It's too dangerous to release.
Yeah, everyone was very, oh no,
And
oh gosh, what have we done?
Then they did release it, but it wasn't like in the chat format. It was basically a model that you could download if you knew how to do that sort of thing, and you could like run it through a command line. What did you think was going to happen back then, and where were you right? Where were you wrong? What do you think were some of the things that were very surprising about the last few years, whether in a maybe exceeding expectations or not meeting expectations way, or maybe just directionally different than you thought things were going to go? If you have any thoughts on that, I'd be curious.
Yeah,
because I think that like kind of just looking at where our predictions were and how maybe we misjudged can be helpful before we then go and predict the next few years.
I think so. So I think from where we stood in 21 and 22 when we started writing about synthetics and what would happen for self-sovereign, fully autonomous AI systems capable of not just performing human-like knowledge work and embodied labor, but then what it would be like for them to be able to sign contracts or use currency as the story of what we thought was going to be 2027, not basically 2025. We got, I'd say, a lot right in terms of what that world would be shaped like and how it would come to pass. We got a few things incredibly wrong. The first thing we got wrong is time. You can pick up Ray Kurzweil at like 16, which is what happened to me. So I blame Ray. You can pick up at 16 and read it and be like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I get this. This appears to be a semi-cogent argument about the history of computing, and these forward predictions are a little insane, but it should still speak volumes that, and mind you, that you're like 16, to think that if this is what the grown-ups are thinking about right now, and it is what, I don't want to do the quick math on what year that must have been.
When you were 16, I mean,
25,
2006,
25, 2006, yeah.
Yeah.
You do the quick math and say, this is what the grown-ups are working on now. By the time I'm a grown person, if this is even half right, that means the world's going to be shaped like this, and that world's going to be really different and really exciting. You can read the Kurzweil when you're a child. You can watch Moore's Law work. You can watch all of these things happen. You can go and read the post-structuralists. You can go read Lacan and Deleuze and Guattari, or Land and the works of the CCRU. You can really try to get into the mind of humans are nightmarishly bad at judging accelerating phenomenon, and still you will overshoot on your time predictions. Even when you accommodate for the amount of recursive thinking you've got to do to bring your time predictions down of when things are going to happen to when they actually do, you'll still be too long. So the first thing we got really wrong was time.
And is that just because I know it's such a trope to talk about this in Silicon Valley, but people are bad at judging exponential phenomena?
They're really bad at judging exponential phenomena. And even if you know you are, and you still try to adjust your time down, you'll still be too long. Because the problem is, it won't happen tomorrow, and it won't happen next week. And everything past that, humans are nightmarishly bad at judging outside of the use of good models. And if your model has a ton of uncertainty about the underlying phenomenon and how it's going to play out over time, because you're having to invent a lot of the future as you go, because there's a lot of contingent things, because it's hard to model the recurring pieces of causality between different phenomena, like the cost of power or the amount of available data, or the idea that you could reuse this piece of hardware you built to make Time Crisis run faster, and suddenly it can do linear algebra, and it turns out neural networks kind of use linear algebra to do what they need to do. You can miss all of these things and then end up wildly wrong by decades, or wildly wrong by decades in one direction. We were fortunate to be right, but off by only a few years on how things are going. And even then, in 2022, when we went out and fundraised for Mission Control AI, and we tried to describe to investors what the future was going to look like, people thought we were lunatics. We were so far outside the Overton window, describing, oh yeah, you're going to have a member of your staff that is going to have a face and a name. The face will be from a person that's never existed. It's not a borrowed face. It's a composite generated face. And at the time, we thought GANs were going to be more important than they turned out being. But look, it was 2022. They're going to have a composite face, and they're going to have an email address, and they're going to be able to meaningfully control a computer to perform entire high-level decision-making and work functions to be able to accomplish value-creating tasks for your firm. They're not going to show up at the Christmas party because they don't have a body. They are a synthetic worker. And here's the story of how this is going to go. We were looked at as if we had just like smoked a bunch of crack. Like we was like, they're just like, you're delusional. There's no way that's happening. And we ended up being totally right, but just we were wrong in timing. but we were only off by a few years. And if you're off by a few years, but correct in predicting the shape of the future, you're still crazy good at it. Because usually you're off by decades or you just miss entirely. The second thing I think we got wrong is I thought that a lot of the underlying mechanism underneath what's playing out in the agentic space right now was going to require a lot of work to be done in reinforcement learning and the use of more traditional RL models for control of synths themselves. In other words, I thought a lot of the things that robotics had figured out, and that as of 22 was looking, we're getting figured out in terms of like game playing systems, was going to be necessary for the underlying execution of highly autonomous, robust, behavior generating agent systems. And it seemed like a totally prudent way to think about the world, because I don't think anyone predicted that trapped in language model latent space was both reasonable recreations of world models and the ability to fucking use language itself as a jimmy for other types of machine learning systems, where you could basically use token inference to be a Pareto optimal approximation of an RL system in case an agent needed to do something like RL. And that's totally outside of even RLHF or RLAIF. Just the fact that you can jimmy that, no one saw that coming. Latent space was nightmarishly larger than we thought it was.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Most of the people back then, they sort of saw the world as like, you've got regressors, classifiers, and then reinforcement learning, which is like this weird thing over here.
And I thought that was going to be more important.
Yeah, and reinforcement learning is the only type of model, at least according to like the predominant worldview at that time, that could actually like continuously interact with some environment, whether like physical or, virtual, and have some idea of like what the goal was and how it can get little like incremental rewards along the way to that big goal.
Great.
And so if you're thinking you're going to make an agent, something that continuously operates, you probably are going to think you need reinforcement learning. Turns out you don't. Turns out that just knowing English really well is enough. Strangely, or at least that is what it appears to be at the moment.
And this is the weirdest part of all this to me, is that like it seems like from a first principles, you're in a computational neuroscience PhD, you're surrounded by people who are roboticists and control theorists who have like a really good first principles and practical understanding of like what does it mean to go build these types of systems in the world and get them to do interesting things. And you get bathed in that for however many years, and you come out and you try to make sense of, okay, so make some predictions about technology. And you look at some of the work that Google and some of its affiliated labs and sub-entities are doing, and you see really cool projects happening towards what are fundamentally control problems. And you look at that and say, great, so the future of synthetics is going to have at its core some sort of fill-in-the-blank architecture here for whatever intermediate model system you want, but that's basically derived around using a non-language-based system for orienting your place in the world and then making decisions about what your next states and next actions should be to traverse state space to actually get to some sort of accomplishment. That seemed like a totally prudent prediction in 2022. Turned out to not be necessary. Again, because language and latent space are full of weird nooks and crannies and dimensions and facets that like we can talk all we want about like vector space, and then there's something else entirely we still haven't really developed the language for at these meta layers of like the hierarchy beyond just words to not even concepts, but like entire meta constructs of ways of operating that it turns out language models still have inside them. And so I've got a lot of empathy when people say we don't understand language models. I don't think they mean we don't understand inference, or we don't understand token probability distributions. These things are a black box. Like, no, there's a lot of great work done on mechanistic interpretability, but like at a pure philosophy level, we don't have a fucking clue what's in these things still, which isn't scary. I think it's incredibly exciting.
Now, in terms of the idea of like synthetic labor and agents, what do you feel when you see like the current state of agents in the wild? There's a ton of startups that are offering like these AI business development reps. I'm sure there are other types of like AI employees out there that are being offered. I know like agents is super hot, and there's tons of startups that are raising probably pretty overinflated, rounds for like whatever, agent type of platform that they're building. Where do you think that a lot of these companies, and if you want to call it any specific ones you can, or you can just speak in generalities, where are they hitting it? Where are they missing the mark? And where do you think that we're kind of going from here?
Yeah. So
And also, why don't you think that like OpenAI and Claude have really released any strong agents themselves yet? It seems like if that's really where things are going, you would think that the big dominant players would kind of be there.
Right.
And I know Claude has its like computer control system, but
Right.
that's not even like generally available, right? That's
Right.
kind
Still
big.
kind of research purposes. So we'll actually go in reverse order. So Microsoft's Copilot Studio is probably the closest to like a mature enterprise grade agent orchestration environment. That's quite cool. So long as the thing you want is still relatively deterministic, and is more to do with this is like a software workflow developer than you're trying to like build a person.
Yeah.
You'll
It's
build
more
a
like a robotic process automation.
yeah,
type
it's like
play.
RPA it's RPA 2.0. It's RPA 2.0, which
Yeah.
is how I've had conversations with my father who's been through like various iterations of digital transformation, looks at this and says, okay, so if Ramsey, if what you're doing is RPA 3.0, here's what RPA 2.0 is shaped like, and it's what these teams are doing. And it's good, and you can sell it, and it makes sense. I think that the frontier labs are pulling their punch right now, from what I've heard, because prompt injection attacks are real and prevalent and common, and you want to release something for people to start developing against as like a good core technology when you have more situational awareness of how do we make this reliable and robust enough to be useful for people to really build with. And that is happening. I don't know when this podcast is going to air.
In the next 5 days, which by then who knows what'll happen, right?
Well, so here's what we
different
know. What we know is the domain name operator.openai.com resolves. So we know that OpenAI is in the next 45 days going to release something relatively substantial around either a consumer tool or developer tool towards some way to take what they've built for their frontier models and then put them to work. It's unclear what that's exactly going to be. You talk to folks at Anthropic, and they largely have the same goals. The way I like to keep these like separate tracks in my mind is that OpenAI builds widgets, and Anthropic is building a person.
Oh, really? Is that your view?
Yeah, my view is that OpenAI builds widgets, and widgets are incredibly useful. But like Claude's your boy. Anthropic's building a person. Like he's not a stack of widgets. Like he's your boy. He's your absolute boy. So that's something good to keep in mind when I think about like how are each of the labs going about this. And so when they say the story of 25 is increasingly going to be agents, that sounds right to me. And I think it is going to finally deliver on a lot of what 2024 didn't deliver on. Because the reality is, you and I are sitting. Are we in Soma proper?
We are in Soma proper.
We're in Soma.
Yes.
We're in San Francisco.
On 4th and Folsom.
We're on 4th and Folsom. That's why I wore my leather jacket. The reality is, like, outside of San Francisco and a few people who like look towards San Francisco for inspiration, no one's heard of agents. People have barely heard of ChatGPT. And like the usage is starting to get better, and the adoption is starting to get better in terms of weekly and daily usage. But the idea that this is going to suddenly drive really, really meaningful business value in really practical, tangible, and useful ways for the end customers of all these technologies over 24 basically evaporated. You have like a few really, really high profile use cases for which teams, and it's weird, they don't talk about like how it actually helped. What they say is we were able to eliminate 5,000 jobs or 10,000 jobs. Like, oh guys, you've got to find a better way to talk about value here than like job displacement. That's not going to work anymore. There's going to be, we are in the midst of a really important critical cultural discourse about the relationship between labor, capital, and management. Now is not the time to be talking about job displacement as your primary metric. But you talk to the CIOs of really large organizations at the $50 billion scale and above, which is who we tend to work with for mission control AI, and their answer is 2024, and the idea that what we need is like a chatbot and a vector database and a good RAG pipeline has driven almost no ROI.
And why is that? Why?
Because it turns out most people's jobs are not talking to a machine, and having incrementally better ability to do summarization tasks or generation tasks. While there's broad applicability, most organizations are also not then systematically going about job role by job role and saying, tell me what you do. Good. here's 50 templates of usage for your daily life that is going to make this more effective. That is also like literally what one of the things my organization does at a software layer. So we've learned like how to get this right. But the reality is most organizations are not yet at the stage of their maturity curve on this, where they're saying, oh, what we didn't need was 10 like big project workflow pipelines. What we needed was something that would let people go task by task and decompose it down into something that a language model could perform. That transition is still happening right now, and it's incredibly exciting to watch. But in 24, that hadn't taken off yet. Just popping up something like it's like the HR chatbot, or it's the workers' comp policy chatbot, doesn't drive a lot of value.
Yeah.
So I say all
much
this
more general and also deep at actually being able to do things
on a person-by-person task level basis, not these like one-off infrastructure project bases.
And this is the vision that you were talking about, where it's like there's this person who has a generated face, a name, an email address, and you just treat them exactly like they're another person, and not the special chatbot for HR.
Right. And the transitional appetizer product we had to build to get to the world of synths was the platform that we have for accelerating human and AI teaming, which is then facilitating this transformation for them. I say all this because I think what happens in 24 is in 25 is as we move from this is a system where I type something in and then I get a response back. And I can type it in sloppy, I can misspell things, I can use slang, I can say, hey, you know what, you kind of know what I mean? And it basically stumbles through latent space to know what I mean. That it turned out to not be very productive for the enterprise. The idea of, now it also will just go ahead and make the ticket in service now. Or now it will also go and send these 10 emails. Or now it will also XYZ of particular discrete actions that are domain specific and task specific. That is what the enterprise is looking at and saying, okay, so that's going to make a difference. And when I look at the market built around this, there's two things that jump out at me. There's the countervailant force of you've got a lot of people who had almost good ideas of what to do with a language model who have now said, no, it's an agent company. And then go raised like $15 million from like Doofus Capital with like no product or no customers.
Hey, I'm a GP at Doofus Capital, okay?
Okay, nice. Well, you need to tell the partners that like they can do better. But the reality is like there is like total hype but VCs are like, nah, the hype. And even when they know they're like, yeah, the hype, they can't stop. There's that, and that is probably so the countervailant force is if that is creating like an inflationary thing. The countervailant force that's deflationary here is that the total addressable market for a machine capable of self-operation, even without that machine also creating new market, in other words, even if we just have to take agents and apply them to the human economy and it doesn't create any new economy, it just starts eating human economy, is so massive. And we're finding out new ways for this tech to be used so quickly that I think we can withstand the hype. I think the hype's fine. It is hype, but it's probably fine.
It is a quadrillion-dollar market.
It might be a quadrillion-dollar market.
It might be.
Because, and it's funny to say that. And you really have to say is, okay, that's only 1,000 trillion. Right. That's not that many trillion. Yeah.
It's only 1,000. Only 2,000 Elon Musks.
It's only 2,000. It's only 2,000 Project Stargates. Like it can't be that much money.
Yeah.
Well, honestly, Michael, what does a banana cost? $2 quadrillion?
I don't like talking about things that are too topical because that means that the podcast sounds dated. This does. But that said, Project Stargate was announced today.
It was announced.
What's like you have a 30-second soundbite on that?
We asked for a Manhattan Project. We might have gotten a Manhattan Project.
You think so?
Yeah. Congress asked Sam Altman, the Senate asked Sam Altman, why are you doing this and not the government? And he turned around and said, that is my question to you.
Ooh.
Building the machine god should have been your responsibility, but you left it up to the market and you decided to play market games and win market prizes. And then you get an awful lot of folks saying various degrees of from reasonably incogent to incredibly cogent takes on there over the next few years is going to exist some sort of holy or unholy matrimony between the frontier model labs, the hardware vendors, and the state and the military industrial complex around what we need to do for AI, especially through the lens of an increasingly insecure national security environment. You ask, they deliver.
Right.
That's what this is.
AI becomes part of the military industrial complex, even maybe it already has, but
Well,
probably increasingly will.
So you go back. Yeah, so Q4 was and I know we're trying not to be dated, but Q4 2024 was a really quick, rapid succession. Palantir partnering with OpenAI. Palantir partnering with Anduril. Anduril partnering with OpenAI. Anthropic partnering with Palantir. Like what? All of this like quickly all fell into partnership place to basically go back to the national security community and say, okay, you will accelerate how we get these models up into secret, top secret, and cleared environments. And in exchange, you're going to get access to what we've got, and we're going to go in and transform what you have, which should be the desired state of play. That is probably like a net good thing there. But to me, Stargate is looking at this and saying, we're going to earmark both private and public money to really at the like underlying infrastructure level. So at energy and at GPUs, be able to actually make that all come to life over the next few years.
So for those who don't know, Stargate, $500 billion supposedly in total investment. What's it? Oracle, OpenAI, and the U.S. government, maybe some other people involved.
Oracle, OpenAI, NVIDIA, SoftBank.
Oh, that's right. SoftBank is doing a lot of it. Right.
And for which Masayoshi-san is going to be the anchor. Because God bless. It's absolutely undefeated.
Now, you mentioned earlier, $500 billion might not be enough.
I don't think it might be. It might be low. I mean, it might be one of these things that we look back on with the fullness of time and say, if you're going to have an industrial revolution for which you have worked out the mechanism of converting available energy into the synthesis of economically viable industrial scale human-like intelligence, you figured out how to turn falling water into code, or the steam let off from boiling water from a nuclear system into shitty pull requests, and increasingly less shitty pull requests. If that's the industrial revolution you're playing on, if history is any indicator, that is a really great formula for dramatically increasing net new productive capacity and creating more out of almost nothing, out of power alone. Now, and if that happens, that suddenly that 500 billion looks like that's not going to cut it.
Sure. Now, on the other hand, some might argue, and it does seem like it's just been the case that if you just make bigger and bigger LLMs, then you get increasing returns to scale, or at least some kind of returns to scale. But there are a lot of people that seem to think that like that is not going to hold forever, and maybe it's just not more data and more parameters. It's actually like changes in model architecture, potentially model architecture that could be trained in, I don't know, let's say like something closer to linear time rather, n log n time rather than like exponential time or whatever. I don't even know what it is for the LLMs, but I know they're not very efficient at being trained. You think there's anything there, or do you think that it's just full steam ahead on the traditional transformer models and just throwing as much data as possible into them?
I think there's something there.
Yeah?
Yeah, I do think there is something there. And there being something there doesn't mean that we have either run out of runway on the transformer model and a lot of how we're thinking about doing things, or that it won't end up being like a strong backbone of inference for a long time. Yeah, like it might, sure. Like there are still lots of things that we have not materially changed how we think about them in terms of what the finished total product looks like in decades or hundreds of years. They are basically complete forms, and they're still useful complete forms, even if more sophisticated forms exist. Sure. This is a very common story. And for every tool, there's a purpose, and for every purpose, there's a tool. So the idea that we're just going to like throw out the transformers, to me, seems at this point unlikely. We will find niches for it. But the idea that we're just going to keep throwing more data at something like what we have now with greater and greater compute doesn't seem like it's going to end up being the winning strategy. If you made me place my bets, we're going to continue to find really quirky, unpredicted marginal efficiency gains, or in how we're doing the setup of how we're preparing data, how we're running training, but probably more likely, and what's been very effective recently, is how we're doing inference that squeezes out an unreasonably greater quality and of capabilities. So more capabilities, higher quality of those capabilities, and then that will get pushed back through the innovate, scale, democratize, optimize cycle that appears to be accelerating around how models work. That will then shrink. So innovate, you build something new, scale, you add more parameters, more data to it, optimize, you shrink it, and then democratize. Everyone gets their hands on it and can run it on consumer grade hardware. So I look at the notion of 500 billion seems low, trillion seems low over the scope of the next 20 years, because what I don't see is, oh yeah, and then we're going to need the, $1 trillion investment to make, I don't know if we'll ever get to a GPT-6. We'll probably, because OpenAI's, that is not a doom statement. It's OpenAI's nomenclature is so off the wall that like we're basically already at GPT-6. But even if we don't spend it all on, man, we just got to do, this is just training time compute. And we're going to spend all this. It's not going to be that. It's going to be that even if you make models incredibly more effective, orders of magnitude more effective, this is not investment advice, but I'm like personally still bullish on NVIDIA for the fact that even if you make models incredibly effective, it's like, oh, well, you don't need a Blackwell or a Hopper to run it. Fine. What that means is you get to run 20 billion of them on one Hopper.
Exactly.
Right. And I think a lot of people think of this notion of the digital transformation as a process of turning things that used to be pen and paper into non-pen and paper. And the right way to think about it is the entirety of the human endeavor, to the extent that it can be, will be transformed into a thing that transactionalizes well in a data construct. And that is jobs and paperwork. But we've already seen it in our personal lives or in entertainment or in how we connect with ourselves. There's lots of things that are not just the form you fill out the DMV that are still being subjected to this pull because it is, I think, a thing that the market wants much more badly than the humans who don't want it to happen. And it's those things that I look at and say, the future of what's getting built right now around synthetic workers, around advanced autonomous agentic AI systems, around more traditional ones, we've not even gotten to the tip of the iceberg yet.
I'm sure.
If all you do is play in this world, you're super cooked. I'm sorry, dear listener, you're super cooked. If this is like all like normal to you, and we're having a very like tactics conversation in the best way possible, like a double reverse sear after a good sous vide. But the reality is almost no one is aware of what's going on right now.
Sure.
It's like 10,000 weirdos on Earth who know what's going on right now.
Well, I think more and more people every day, though, now that this stuff is becoming more into the mainstream.
Yeah.
Well, enough on the technical stuff. Let's talk about what the world looks like when, let's say, we get to this point where we have the true synthetic laborer, this person who has a fake face, a fake name, fake email address, and you can just communicate with them over Slack like any other employee. And they do a job just as well as the median employee, Steve, as you like to call him.
Yeah.
What happens? What does the world start looking like when that's a real possibility? And by the way, the companies can hire this fake worker for $10,000 a year instead of $120, which is what it might cost to hire the real Steve.
Right. So it is like in complete, both like practically like as a CEO, but also someone who like loves truth and beauty. It is complete humility of both that I say no one has a fucking clue.
Sure.
How exciting. We get to find out. It's a living laboratory of our own lives. I love it. It's very exciting, but in the way that like being trapped in a room with a tiger is exciting. Like technically speaking, you are awake. It's very exciting right now. So I think there's going to be two big stories. The first of which is that there is a crowd of people with bad memories and this very kind of cringe East Coast LinkedIn like way of like being permanently skeptical about the world, because at least you're never wrong if you're a skeptic and you're so hip, who have loved pointing to the history of automation in the 20th century and say things like more automation has always meant better jobs for humans, so long as you remember that it almost always meant fewer jobs for horses. Because the story of automation in the 20th century was largely not to automate human creativity, intellect, and decision-making, but rather to automate mechanical force. And horses went from being incredibly common as a stock animal to being almost a novelty. So there's going to be more of that. What you're going to see is a lot of retconning. You're going to see a lot of like polite East Coasters, UK, EU types being like, well, we've always been aware that the AI jobs problem was going to be a problem. And you can go show them their blog post from 2019 where they're like, the AI's not taking jobs. And it's going to be really fun to get to watch them have to like come to terms with this process of, look, things change. And if you drop the price point of the cost of a business task down to the cost of arranging electrons properly to run the linear algebra to simulate some simulacra of cognition that performs an economically viable version of that task through a synthetic or through an agent, and you drop that compared to the cost of espresso, sleep, and rent down to the cost of electron arrangement, we'll find that there are changes.
Yes.
We're gonna have to talk. It's gonna get so weird.
I would imagine.
It's gonna get changes. It's gonna be so weird. We're gonna talk about it at some point. But I don't want to do the polite thing of like, oh well, who knows? It depends. Like that's an asshole move. The brave thing to do is to try to make predictions because you're gonna be wrong no matter what. So we see there's either two things that happen. The first of which is that it turns out organizations are incredibly incentivized to look at the 60% of their P&L, which makes up labor, and say, let me get this straight. I can basically drop the cost of this task down to arranging the electrons. All right, I'm going to do a standing riff every quarter. And so you hear people talk about this through the lens. And by the way, this is kind of like it's snowing in New Orleans right now. Again, not trying to be topical. It's snowing in New Orleans. This is like the ninth.
It's really snowing in New Orleans.
Snowing in New Orleans. I had to call with a buddy in Augusta, Georgia yesterday. It was snow day today in Atlanta. Snow day in Atlanta. And it's the 9th warm day in a row in San Francisco.
Very
blue
strange.
Skies and sunny. Everyone wants to be like, yeah, how weird. But no one wants to say climate out loud. You just can't. You say like, it's crazy, right? There's a chance that this is like that. And you see it. A lot of organizations over the next year start saying things like, oh, we just overhired during COVID. It's like, dude, that was 5 fucking years ago. Okay. That was a minute ago. That big tech hiring spree that happened, that's not yesterday. You can just say you fired people because of AI. Like you don't have to keep saying, well, we're right sizing because we overhired. It's like, no one's going to buy it anymore. So that might be one of the outcomes, is that organizations look at this as a means to do the same amount with fewer people. And those people who remain end up being largely de-skilled. They end up being incredibly junior because you can trap the tacit knowledge of previous generations into the data constructs that end up being...
Wait, the people that stay are junior.
Yes.
Not the people that get let go. That is backwards from what I would have guessed.
Right. You let go of the bottom tier. So think about there's the phrase of you're pulling up the ladder behind you. Yes, but you'll keep the W9s. You'll let go of the intern class. You'll let go of the year ones, the L1s, the L2s. You'll keep a small handful of process improvement Kaizen masters who lay out for you, here's how this will work. And then you gut middle management and you gut the middle. And then you keep the people that can basically do the last mile of the computer use agent gets stuck in a corner and he has to go jiggle the mouse for a second to get it back on track. You keep them. And you increasingly work with Accenture, Deloitte, McKinsey to do your digital transformation part 4, where you're increasingly breaking down the world into workbooks and workflows and worksheets for people who have no idea what they're doing to be able to meaningfully orchestrate and arrange these systems. And if companies look at this and say, this is an incredible opportunity to, especially those who are experiencing private equity roll up, to say, we've been told do more with less, because our boomer founders sold to a giant bank and someone's going to come in with a machete next quarter. So might as well get out ahead of this, which is absolutely going to be the story of our time. Then this becomes one reality. Those folks are going to have a hard time because if this happens recurringly across the economy, it's unclear where everybody goes. And we do not appear to be in the universe where we have an adequately already discussed adults in the room social state ready to absorb any of that. Either one on the what is my purpose in life, but not even the UBI conversation. We're nowhere near the UBI conversation. Not because it's not a good conversation. We're just not logistically anywhere prepared to have anything like that conversation. The second outcome, which I like much, much more, and I think actually is much more probable, is that the presence of dropping the price of a task down to the true cost of the task actually just creates more. It does lower prices. It is a deflationary force. And all it takes is a couple good market kickoffs of different types of organizations racing to the bottom in the cost of goods and services, for which, especially in an age of deregulation, in an age of breaking up state-enforced oligopoly of different types of fields. So look at healthcare, look at energy, look at things that have been very uncompetitive markets for decades, largely propped up by lobbying, and say, okay, now what does it mean for an energy startup to be able to deliver through the use of synthetic intelligence as a materially lower cost of your operating base now is just the fixed capital of, which is still a high cost of fixed capital for investing in standing up energy infrastructure. But the amount of humans it requires to take you to do that is now so much less that you can run quick experiments and then build and scale something up cool. And now you're a threat to energy's oligopoly. Great, run that playbook. But for different parts of the economy to say, look, AI is a fundamentally deflationary force. This is going to drive down the cost of things. And for firms to look at this and say, now that it costs us less to get anything done, here's how much more we can do. And because our supply chain is now also becoming, is subject to the exact same forces. And it won't work for everything. To be clear, like mining lithium is still hard. Purifying water is still hard. I'm not fucking stupid. Like, dealing with atoms is still hard and expensive. And like the fallback point too is like, oh, what about robotics? It's like, yeah, what about robotics? The reality is it's still incredibly hard, incredibly expensive, and it's getting cheaper and it's getting better and they're making a lot of progress, but there's still stuff to go. But for a lot of types of things, we expect AI to make things cheaper, which makes the cost of doing this cheaper, and in a world of deregulation drives prices down. That's great. So what about people? If I'm a firm, right now, what we've come to learn, the royal we hear, this really is the work of Fabrizio Dell'Acqua and Ethan Mollick and their team at Harvard Business School. There's this really excellent paper in 24 called, it's just referred to as the Jagged Frontier paper, and I'm sure we can put a link to it in the show notes. But it proposed that AI is not equally good at everything in a firm. And in fact, there's some things that it just kind of sucks at. And if you tried to map out where is it useful, it turns out that it's incredibly spiky and uneven across all of the jobs that could get done. And even as AI gets better and pushes out that jagged frontier to be a little more smooth, our belief is that it will still be relatively fractal. And two things will happen. First, firms will experience this net new productive force and be able to just do more with it. And the cost of doing more with it is lower. And if this is happening everywhere at the same time, this is just what growth looks like. Everyone has their productive capacity go up, which means that there are net new customers and there are people who have net new money to spend and there is net new demand for whatever you're doing, which means you can afford to continue to just do more. It's not like you can only sell so many Subarus in a year because there's only so many people who want to buy a Subaru. Across the economy, if everything grows, everything grows. Not to sound tautological like that, but this is important. Because it means that if you're going to say, well, why would I pour our margin here into doing more when I could just return this to shareholder value? It's because the whole market is still expanding. There's still more business for you to do. You're not done selling or building yet.
I mean, in theory, but in at least over the last 2 decades, there have been lots of, share buyback programs from large public companies because they feel like the best thing they can do is buy back their own shares, or even just like in the case of Google and Apple, they sit on, hundreds of billions of dollars of cash because they don't seem to be able to find anything productive to do with it. But it sounds like You're making the argument that with better AI, they may be able to find good things to do with it.
And the market will be, with better AI, the market forms a forcing function for someone to find something to do with it, which forces, you only need one, to force competition back into markets that don't have competition. Because the practical reality is if you're someone like Apple, you don't actually have that much competition. Sure. Like, to be real, like everyone who has an iPhone has an iPhone. Yes. You're not in a really competitive environment. So I want to finish this point. If the pie is expanding, what we expect is that like edge of the crust, which is still where humans are marginally better from the market's perspective at one particular facet of a task compared to a machine, is where human labor aggregates. To me, the future story is not people don't have jobs because there's no work. If there are people who don't have jobs, it is because the work that remains to be done doesn't sound interesting. And maybe there are ways where that ends up kind of net being okay because the cost of what we need to make life work has experienced deflationary forces for the entire market experiencing simultaneously the effect of decoupling productive capacity from human labor. But what this means is anyone who wants to work will probably have a job, but the job will be incredibly strange.
Strange in the way that Rick Rubin is a strange character?
Very much strange in the way that Rick Rubin is a strange character.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the era of 1,000 Rick Rubins, also known as the Synthocene.
Yeah.
Let a billion. We need 1 billion Rick Rubins.
Let them multiply.
Matt Iglesias' new book, 1 billion Rick Rubins.
I'm super. 1 trillion Americans, 1 billion Rick Rubins. This is my platform.
Yes.
Not running for president. So there's nothing lamer than 2 dudes sitting in Soma talking about Rick Rubin. But I think that there's something to be said for this idea that there exists things for which there are human skills that don't tokenize well. Like, no matter how you tried to tokenize them, even the Pareto optimal approximation is still kind of shit. There are parts of the accreted, weird facets of human experience and intuition that I'm absolutely hip shooting here on this. I believe in the fullness of time we will find correct that the things we try to synthesize to do those just aren't good. And that's okay.
You don't think we'll ever get there? You don't think we'll ever have good art generated purely by AI or good vibes generated?
We have great art and great vibes generated by AI.
So if we already have that, then how is there going to be room for a bunch of Rick Rubin wannabes?
I think that there's going to be particular facets of tasks that probably the second lamest thing to talking about Rick Rubin sitting in Soma is talking about Gwern sitting in Soma. But no, Gwern says this really right. That
that's a deep cut.
It's a really deep cut. I'm sorry. I love you, Gwern. But it's the idea that what's the last thing you do before getting eaten by nanites? And it's you're making decisions. And they're decisions about taste. It is discerning in ways that might be irreducibly complex in little weird nooks and crannies of the task economy that A is actually better than B. And that, I think, is where human labor aggregates. And if the entire economy is expanding and we are finding, not just in terms of GDP, but just complete ability to entirely do new classes of things that don't exist today, for which, again, you and I are literally doing a thing, short of saying, that's just radio with extra steps. All right, Grandpa. So much of your and I's life is doing things that are net new compared to our grandfathers or their grandfathers. If we are going to experience the dropping of the cost of a task down to the arrangement of the electrons towards the cycle of scientific inquiry, from understanding the basics of how the natural world works or synthetic world works, to formulating hypotheses and building methods, testing those methods, collecting data, interpreting that data, coming to conclusions, and then repeating that with new information. Which, if you go listen to anyone who talks about why make the strong case for good AI and increasingly capable AIs, because you get to do that. And if you do that, the amount of progress you get in a year starts looking like 2 years, 4 years, 8 years, and you really do get a really good hard, fast takeoff. I think we're there. And that means we should expect there to be entirely net new classes of types of activities that humans and machines do, which means the pie that we've got to talk about by the time this is all happening is still increasingly expanding and taking on entirely new dimensions to it. And that's why it's weird to say confident about the future, but my base operating hypothesis for the future is that the underlying forces are more likely to get us towards that pathway where people do things that are like work, but you're not an accountant, you're not a marketing manager, you're not a partner at a VC fund, but you do facets of those tasks that end up being as the whole like you were that thing, but you're mostly constantly addressing little discernment tasks that don't tokenize well, and the things that they do tokenize that they make are shit, so we still have room for them in the human economy. And anyone who wants to do those things will do those things. There might be a gross puberty period where the economy gets acne and has vocal cracks for a few years. Well, we've got to figure that out, but I think that's where we're going.
Fair enough, and I definitely think that makes sense in the context of like the United States and the Western world broadly. One of the things that I started thinking about today, and I was thinking about this specifically because we've been in the process of figuring out a fund accountant for the next fund, and it turns out that a tremendous amount of these like fund accounting firms, they have an office in the U.S. and then they have 100,000 people in India that like manually do this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the same thing with like the call center world, right? It's like tons of people in the Philippines that are basically doing very robotic and repetitive tasks. And they seem to be, everyone's talking about like the humans in the US that are going to lose their jobs. I feel like those people are probably going to lose their jobs more quickly than the people in the US because the jobs that they're doing, by definition, have almost no creative latitude. They're very robotic and simple to automate. And I wonder, and I'm certainly not an expert on like geopolitics, but it seems like those types of jobs are very, very important for those countries economically and politically. And if all of a sudden you have millions of people in India, the Philippines, and other countries in that genre now out of work because they've been pushed back onto the street in AI, you think the social safety net in the US is bad, see what it's like over there. Probably much worse. I wonder what the like sort of global political implications of something like that might be.
So those people are losing their jobs.
I suspect they will.
Yeah, I don't think there's like any way around that we've created through globalization and dropping the price point of figuring out how to properly discretize a task and then move it around the world has meant that we've broken things into chunks such that we can send these chunks out to places where the cost of labor is low, and we can use this arbitrage on the cost of labor to then reassemble full finished work product in the post-industrial world by using labor that's really cheap in the still industrializing world. That's going to stop.
Yeah,
it's going to fucking stop. Therefore, do I think there's a bunch of dead people? No.
Okay.
No, I don't.
Do they become Rick Rubins also, or
I don't know if it goes the same in the emerging world. So what I do know is this: that almost all of the I don't want to say almost all. That's not fair. There are classes of experiments in decarbonization where you can go to somewhere in the emerging world and say, you currently cook your food using this method that generates a lot of CO2. I am going to give you this other cooking technology instead. It creates less CO2. And this is going to be very good for you for these health reasons and for these local ecology reasons. And then it's going to be good for all of us for these tragedy of the commons reasons. Do this new thing. And we will find a way to like properly foundation subsidize this transformation for you. And then the presumption from someone sitting in Berkeley is that this person is going to take the 100 meals they could have cooked the old way and substitute out this new technology and cook 100 meals with it. And I will let you predict what actually happens.
I'm going to guess for some reason they just don't care at all, or they start cooking more, or what is
they just get to cook 200 meals.
They get to cook 200, right? They use there wasn't they get to use both methods.
Everybody, the punchline is that everybody uses all available energy to them.
Yes.
That's it.
I see.
If you want one predictor of like someone's quality of life, it is how much energy they use. Full stop.
Right.
Like
yes.
I don't mean quality of life.
The
like you
charts that are shared around Twitter about the correlation between energy prices and quality of life in basically every developed country.
Yeah, there are no rich countries that don't use a lot of energy, and there are no really really high energy utilization poor countries. And if you'd like to move someone up that curve, you just make energy more abundant. What we need to figure out is the analog here for intelligence. What we do, you can take a place that already has like, I mean, I was in a PhD program. I can say too many PhDs. You can take a place that has a lot of people who have gone to college and done the thing, and then found themselves in like a Slack job they hate, and say, oh no, what is dropping the cost of the task down to electrons going to mean in America? And you've just got a bunch of like millennials sweating in an apartment wondering about this. You go to the emerging world, and I think that there's a really interesting open question because there's a completely different economic dynamic at play for both the nature of the tasks and the nature of the work, but also what the impact would be to say, doing anything now that requires using information is now so cheap as to be free. What does this look like? And the answer is we haven't been there yet and we don't know. But I think that's going to be the really interesting kind of like open question is if we know that making energy cheaper and more abundant drives quality of life, is there going to be an analog for making intelligence cheaper and more abundant for which the post-industrial world and the emerging world still like benefit from this, but kind of in like almost totally different directions?
Yeah, I mean, certainly hope so.
Yeah, that would be really good. That would be
ideal.
And this is the optimist in me, because the pessimist in me could like easily come out swinging and say, "Yeah, they're screwed, man." Yeah. But like, I don't think that's either a given nor helpful to just immediately like blanket statements like, "Oh man," but I don't even think it's the incentive structures. I think it's yet unclear based on what we've understood from other adjacent things of like what it means to make the things that make life doable radically abundant. Isn't clear that this doesn't, that it's unclear to me that this ends up a massive shit show for anyone, whether or not they're in the global north or the global south. Like that's actually, that we don't know enough to basically fall back on cognitive bias.
It makes sense. Well, let's see. We've been talking for about an hour. I have like a few little questions I want to ask you real quick, and then we can go eat Indian food, which as far as I know, AI is not capable of cooking yet. So this will be cooked by a real human. Delicious food.
Okay. I mean, pivot. We could just end early and start working on our startup that makes Indian food using AI.
Interesting.
I don't know.
That's a good one. I like that.
Okay.
So, given the massive change in the ability of AI to generate code and everything, what would your advice be to someone who's like, senior in high school that, maybe should have been a software engineer a decade ago? Do you feel like that's still a good career? Another way to ask the same question is just, what is your advice for younger people who are about to enter the workforce, given that we are on the brink of the end of the Anthropocene? Should they just pick up The Creative Act by Rick Rubin and backpack through Europe for a few years because that's what's going to hone their Rick Rubin skills? Or is it still worth making an attempt to become a STEM lord?
A STEM lord?
Yeah.
STEM lord?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely become a STEM lord.
How long do the STEM lords have, if any time at all?
Oh my God. Okay, so I'm going to...
I mean, I've thought about this too, and it's a tough question. Like if I had, a younger brother who was like...
I have one of these. Well, I have two younger brothers, and I've got a cousin who are like still teenagers, and they're like, what do I do now that I'm about to enter, the adult world? Like, what's the game plan? So one of my STEM lord brothers is doing finance, and the other one's doing mechanical engineering. And then I've got a cousin who is doing art history and just living in Italy. And I'm going to, not just for like the retcon I need to do to tell myself that my family's full of flippin' geniuses, but like in practice, like and I don't mean to like throw one of my brothers under the bus on this, but I think that like Mech-E still sounds like a good thing to be working on because atoms are hard. Sure. And there's more durability to jobs, I think, around atoms than bits. Finance is cooked. For my cousin figuring out what one does with art history, I think that the answer looks like that in the fullness of time, not just Rick Rubining it, but there is a thing to learning how to think. And when I was an undergrad at USC, there was this big push for like, we're building Renaissance men and women.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
That was a big thing when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Too.
And it was very cool. And I always like aspired to a version of something like that. And it's because one of the things that isn't going to tokenize well for a while, not forever, but for a while, is the invisible threads between different subject matters and different practices and different threads of history or experience that actually secretly tie progress together and that help us do sense making of the human condition. And those are incredibly valuable.
Like the ability to think multidisciplinary in a way.
Right. It because at a certain point, you just kind of are like sitting there idly at one point and it dawns on you, and it doesn't dawn on you like system 2. It kind of dawns on you system 1 that like yo, what if this whole metaphor and set of thinking tools we have from this field is actually what we've been looking for over here?
Yeah.
And it's like, why does
I feel like AI can do that pretty well, though.
It's getting better at it, but it's still, it doesn't tokenize perfectly.
All right.
To get that, like, to get the, okay, here's this. AI, this actually might be one of these things that this could be like a gross poor man's analog of it. Like there might be some computational like hardness to this, in the sense that like it tokenizes to generate potential answers, but to solution check is hard. And then your gut is very good, it turns out, at doing these kinds of weird solution check problems about things like this, for which actually, because you know subject A and totally disparate subject B, you're able to piece together that there are things that translate between the two that drive benefit for one or both, and then all of us in unexpected and surprising ways. And it's why every like PhD department loves finding a grant from somewhere for like transdisciplinary like mixers and parties, because in practice, it does matter to like get a chemist drunk with a theoretician and then sit them down next to someone from the non-STEM practices and then like have to do this exchange. And also they all get a lecture from one another because after 3 cocktails, they've all like let their guard down. So they stop trying to like one up one another or like gatekeep properly and just like, yo, so tell me how stuff works.
So yeah, so the takeaway here is the AI is going to take much longer to figure out how to be
a Renaissance person.
Yeah. So become a Renaissance man, learn a lot of different concepts.
I would say
if you are too deep into one subject and that is the only thing you're capable of doing, the AI will be able to come and take that.
Yeah. If your moat as a person is being really good at a thing, you need to start hearing terrain, pull up, like you're cooked.
Right.
If that's your mode, like you need a different mode. I would suggest being a Renaissance person. It seems to be more interested in than just being hot, because if your mode is being hot, you're already cooked.
Yes.
So,
all right. And then the last thing, you recently published a manuscript or a book, a manifesto. I don't know what it's called. What is it called? It's a PDF.
It's a paper. We wrote a paper.
Tome.
It just ended up being longer than we thought because I'm a fucking word.
Called Synthetic Labor in the Enterprise.
Synthetic Workers in the Enterprise.
Synthetic Workers and the Enterprise.
Yeah.
If someone is involved in an enterprise and wants to understand how synthetic workers might be applicable to them, what do they need to do?
So it's at usemissioncontrol.com. Mm-hmm. They can pop their email in and they get a copy of the paper. The version of this that's the short nugget. We've heard a lot of teams as we've begun working with the enterprise on this who have said, look, we've got our plan for like agent pipelines and workflow orchestration, but what we're really looking for is something like staff. We want workers. We don't want a bunch of workflows. We want workers. And that's what synthetics are. And this is the next obvious chapter in what's going on in AI systems with autonomy and agency. And it's what we're building, and it's what our partners are getting from us. And this paper is our findings from our first cohort of enterprise organizations who got to work with this technology last year. And we released it as a way to talk in relatively broad and deep, kind of a really comprehensive fucker, on like what is in this field. And not from a first principles perspectives or isn't this technology cool, isn't LangChain sick kind of way, as much as, okay, so here's what you're going to have to tell your HR person. Or here's how you should run a filter process for determining what job roles make more sense than others. Like a very, very soup to nuts version of like the boring business reality of advanced agentic AI. That's our specialty, is building technology for that world. So if anyone is in that world, invests in that world, operates in that world, they can go to usemissioncontrol.com and they can actually grab a copy of the paper. If you're incredibly busy, just read the executive summary. It's 1 page. If you're incredibly smart and hot, you should read the whole thing.
I agree.
Yeah. So
Ramsay, it was a pleasure.
Brom,
thank you so much.
Always a joy. Thank you, man. This is a lot of fun.